A flight attendant tried to humiliate a black CEO mid-flight, but what he did next left the entire cabin in stunned silence. He thought humiliating a man would earn him power. He didn't realize the one he struck carried more strength than anyone on board. Subscribe if you believe cruelty never flies without consequence. The moment the seatbelt light blinked off, the tension in the first-class cabin thickened like fog. Dr. Adrian Vance looked up from his datapad, eyes calm but alert, sensing a change in the atmosphere. He had boarded Flight Astra 219 with quiet efficiency, seated in 2A, surrounded by empty rows and the sterile hush that came with early morning departures. The faint scent of sanitized leather mingled with the sterile coolness of conditioned air. Outside the small oval window, the sky stretched pale and cold above the clouds, but inside, something less visible had begun to tighten its grip. He didn't notice the man 2 rows ahead at first, not until the cabin jolted with a sudden tremor of turbulence and the flight attendant turned his head, locking eyes with him for a fraction too long. Rhett Malden. The name tag flashed as he passed, fastened just above a crisply pressed shirt and the kind of practiced smile that looked more like a performance than hospitality. Adrian gave a polite nod and returned his focus to the tablet in his lap, scanning notes from the recent merger meeting. Numbers, forecasts, confidential projections, all vital, all sensitive. Yet even as he read, something gnawed at the edge of his awareness. A stare, a presence, a temperature drop that had nothing to do with cabin climate control. "Coffee," came the voice, suddenly close. Adrian looked up. Rhett stood by his side, tray in hand, smile thin as a blade. "Yes, please, black." "Thank you," Adrian said with measured politeness. Rhett poured with theatrical care, then paused before handing over the cup. "Of course, sir, for the king of mergers." His tone was smooth but laced with a mockery that didn't match the words. His eyebrows lifted slightly, waiting for a reaction. Adrian met his eyes. "Thank you," he said evenly, not rising to the bait. Their hands didn't touch, but it felt like static passed between them. Rhett turned away, disappearing down the aisle without another word. Adrian sipped the coffee, then placed it aside, unsettled. Not because of the insult, he'd weathered worse in boardrooms, but because of the deliberate pressure in Rhett's delivery. It wasn't the jab of a frustrated employee, it was the testing of boundaries, the way a man checks for weaknesses before striking. He closed the datapad and reclined slightly, letting his eyes drift over the cabin. Empty seats, closed window shades, muted chatter from coach beyond the divider. The quiet was deceptive. Too quiet. Behind his composed expression, Adrian's mind ticked forward. He reviewed the week's events, the finalized merger, the press conference, the closed-door rejection of a private security firm offering biometric surveillance, Lathan Corp. They had pitched aggressively, but Norel Dynamics had declined, citing ethics concerns and data instability. He remembered the firm's representative, a sharply dressed man with a glassy stare and clipped voice. Nolan, something. Adrian had dismissed the name at the time. Unimportant. Just another vendor trying to sell inflated promises. But now, alone in the first-class cabin with the same name nagging at his memory and a flight attendant whose hostility felt too pointed to be coincidence, Adrian's instincts stirred. He reached for the datapad again, fingers pausing over the lock screen. He wasn't paranoid by nature, but success had taught him the value of caution, especially when smiles turned too sharp. Another tremor rattled the cabin. Mild turbulence, but enough to jostle his untouched coffee slightly in the cup. The lights above flickered once. No announcement from the cockpit followed. No reassurance, just the whisper of air vents and the creak of metal. Rhett passed by again. No cart, no tray, just walking, slow and aimless, glancing sideways at Adrian without stopping. Their eyes met again. This time, the flight attendant didn't smile. Adrian didn't speak, but he sat straighter. Something was off. It wasn't just personal dislike, it was targeted discomfort. A quiet campaign of pressure. The coffee delivery. The lingering looks. The sarcasm disguised as service. 2 seats across, a younger flight attendant with soft features and a nervous demeanor paused, pretending to adjust a tray. Adrian caught his eye. The man looked away quickly, then leaned slightly forward toward Rhett, whispering something. Rhett didn't turn. He simply walked on, vanishing behind the curtain at the rear of the cabin. Adrian's hand tightened around the edge of his armrest. Whatever this was, it was no accident. He glanced down at the coffee again. Steam no longer rose from the surface. It sat perfectly still, dark and still, like the calm before a wave hits the shore. Then a sudden clatter from the galley jolted him. It wasn't loud, but it echoed unnaturally in the cabin. Adrian looked over his shoulder. No one appeared, no apology, no explanation. Just the quiet, tense air stretching tighter with each passing minute. He looked out the window. Endless clouds, miles above any help. Another passenger snored softly several rows back. Otherwise, the silence remained, claustrophobic and watching. Adrian exhaled, slow and controlled. His mind shifted gears. This wasn't a normal flight, and Rhett Malden wasn't just an irritated employee. He tapped his wristwatch twice. A soft green light pulsed beneath the surface. Silent activation. Passive audio capture. A feature designed for remote strategy meetings, or unexpected insurance. A shadow passed the curtain again. The game had started. What begins with arrogance often ends with revelation. Adrian Vance didn't see the attack coming. One moment, he was dabbing the spill of coffee that turbulence had flung across his tray, an inconvenience he barely registered, and the next, his body recoiled violently as a white-hot flash of pain erupted through his skull. The sound didn't match the pain. It was barely a sound at all, just the delicate click of a metal stirrer entering the ear canal, and then a noise only he could hear, a ringing so intense it seemed to fracture time itself. Adrian's body lurched sideways in his seat as his right hand clutched his head in reflex. Warm liquid coursed down his jawline, sticky and wet. Blood, unmistakably. The pain was searing, direct, like fire threading through bone. The passengers nearby froze. A man in 2A dropped his newspaper. A teenager with headphones paused his music, mouth slightly open, unsure if he'd just imagined what he saw. The stillness was broken only by the quiet hum of the engines and the subtle creak of the fuselage shifting with altitude. Standing beside Adrian, flight attendant Rhett Malden didn't flinch. He remained still, disturbingly calm, his expression unreadable. His hand, which had just committed the act, hung awkwardly by his side, palm open, fingers twitching as if contemplating a second strike. His lips parted slightly, but no words came. It wasn't guilt. It wasn't fear. It was calculation. Adrian's breathing stuttered as he forced himself upright. His vision blurred at the edges, but his mind, razor-sharp from years of boardroom warfare and executive survival, pierced through the pain. He didn't scream. He didn't shout. He simply stared up at Rhett with a look that burned through civility. It was not confusion. It was recognition. Rhett moved again, a slight twitch of his elbow as if preparing for another jab. But Adrian was faster. His left hand shot forward and caught Rhett's wrist mid-motion. The cabin pressure might have been stable, but the energy inside the first-class compartment shifted violently. The connection of skin on skin was electric, one charged with righteous fury, the other with smothered intent. "You've made your point," Adrian said through gritted teeth, his voice low, controlled, but vibrating with restrained rage. Rhett didn't answer. His eyes locked with Adrian's, a flicker of surprise betraying his otherwise cold demeanor. He hadn't expected resistance, especially not this soon, especially not from a man bleeding, dazed, and minutes from what should have been helplessness. A few rows behind them, Evan Rourke, the junior flight attendant, stumbled forward. His face was pale, eyes wide. "Sir, please, what's happening?" he whispered, trying to position himself between the two men. His hands trembled slightly, but not from turbulence. Adrian didn't look away from Rhett. "You should ask your colleague that," he muttered, pressing a napkin from the tray to the side of his face where blood was now soaking into the collar of his suit. The charcoal gray fabric was turning a deep maroon. "I saw him," Evan stammered. He didn't trip." He leaned in. "Careful," Rhett hissed, voice low enough for only them to hear. "Say more, and you won't have a job when we land." The threat sliced through the air like the stir had through Adrian's skin. Evan froze. Rhett stepped back, forcing a weak smile onto his lips. "Apologies, sir. Let me get that cleaned up for you." His tone was almost mockingly sweet now. Adrian straightened in his seat, pulling the napkin away for a moment to examine the blood. "Don't bother," he said. Still, Rhett lingered. Too long. Adrian watched him carefully. His eyes drifted toward the overhead panel. No recording light, no active sensor blinking from the cabin's security cameras. He scanned the ceiling for a second one. Nothing. His instincts stirred. It wasn't just the attack that unsettled him, it was the design around it. There were no visible witnesses moving to intervene. The passengers seemed trapped in their own uncertainty, unsure if this was a real crisis or a strange in-flight accident. That hesitation was intentional, calculated. When Rhett finally turned away, Adrian exhaled, slow and measured. He wasn't just bleeding from the ear, he was bleeding from a trap. And it was now painfully clear. This wasn't a random act of aggression. This was provocation. A setup. Evan leaned closer, his voice barely audible. "They said to keep an eye on you." "That's all they told me. But this wasn't part of the job." Adrian narrowed his gaze. "Who told you that?" Before Evan could respond, Rhett returned once more, this time empty-handed. He stood tall, face blank, the metal stirrer still peeking out slightly from the pocket of his vest. Adrian reached out, not violently but with deliberate calm, and plucked the stirrer from the pocket. He held it up between them, a sliver of polished metal now tainted red at the tip. Then, without raising his voice, he pressed it firmly against Rhett's chest and said, "If you're going to bury me, do it standing up." The cabin held its breath. Even the engine seemed to hush. Rhett stared at the stirrer, then at Adrian, then at Evan, who backed away. Something had broken in the chain of command, something irreversible. Adrian didn't blink. He wasn't just surviving the assault, he was turning it into evidence. And with that, he dropped the stirrer back onto the tray, crimson-stained and glinting under the cabin light. Pain sharpens more than knives. It reveals intent. Adrian barely had time to react. The stirrer had been plunged so swiftly into his ear canal that his breath caught in his chest before the pain even reached him. But when it did, it hit like a siren going off inside his skull, a burst of searing, white-hot agony that sent shockwaves down his spine. He flinched violently, his hand instinctively reaching to shield his ear as blood slid, warm and steady, down his neck and into the collar of his charcoal suit. Gasps erupted throughout the first-class cabin. The man in 2A dropped his tablet. Someone in 1C rose halfway out of their seat before freezing. But no one moved toward him. No one screamed. The violence had been so unexpected, so surgically precise, it confused everyone into stillness. Rhett Malden didn't flinch. He stood directly over Adrian, the metal stirrer no longer in his hand, but a strange glint remained in his eyes, neither panic nor remorse, but something calculated. He tilted his head slightly, studying Adrian as if observing the result of an experiment. When Adrian looked up, eyes wide with fury and disbelief, Rhett took a single step back, calmly adjusting his tie. "You reached for me," he announced to the cabin in a voice that carried just loud enough for nearby passengers and crew to hear. "I had to protect myself." The words stung more than the pain. Adrian's breath came in short, sharp bursts as he pressed a folded napkin against his ear, trying to suppress the bleeding. Every muscle in his body screamed for retaliation, but his mind, the same mind that had negotiated billion-dollar mergers, fought to stay dominant. If he exploded now, the trap would be complete. He had to think. That's when he noticed it. The blinking cabin sensors, those subtle red lights in the corners indicating the flight's internal cameras were active, were dark. Every one of them. No recording, no footage, no evidence. A calculated silence. Evan Rourke, the junior flight attendant, hovered a few rows away, his face pale beneath the soft cabin lights. He approached hesitantly and leaned down, his voice a trembling whisper. "They're off." Rhett disabled them before takeoff. Said it was a maintenance override. "But I think he planned this." The words spilled out like a confession, barely audible over the steady hum of the engines. Adrian blinked, processing. His hand trembled slightly as he adjusted the napkin. The pain was still there, loud and shrill, but behind it, pieces of a darker puzzle began to lock into place. A targeted attack. A crew member exploiting authority. No footage. A closed space. Witnesses being manipulated. This wasn't personal frustration, it was deliberate sabotage. He didn't know the full plan yet, but he knew he was meant to break, to lash out, to become the story. A shadow fell over him again. Rhett had returned, crouching this time, pretending to check on the passenger. His expression was blank, professional, and laced with the cold efficiency of a man rehearsing his role. "Sir," he said calmly, "I need to inspect your condition for the flight log." "If you'd just sit still." Adrian didn't move. He turned his head slightly, tracking the man's hand. That same hand, the one that had driven the stir into his skull, was now hovering near his lapel. Too close, too composed. And that's when Adrian acted. With a motion as fluid as it was forceful, he reached inside Rhett's service vest and retrieved the object he knew would still be there, the very stirrer used in the assault. His fingers closed around it like a vice. Then, rising slowly, steadily, Adrian stood face to face with his attacker. The cabin seemed to exhale all at once. Passengers leaned out of their seats. Evan stepped forward instinctively but stopped at Adrian's glance, a glance that spoke of control, not chaos. Adrian held the stirrer up, not like a weapon, but like a truth. He pressed the blunt end against Rhett's chest, just above the embroidered name tag. His voice, when it came, was low and deliberate, each word carved through the stale, pressurized air like steel wire. "If you're going to bury me," he said, "do it standing up." Rhett blinked. The stirrer remained pressed to his chest, trembling only slightly with Adrian's controlled rage. His breath hitched, just for a moment, just long enough for the power dynamic to visibly shift. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. Not even a lie. Across the aisle, someone whispered. Another passenger snapped a discreet photo. Evan's hand drifted toward the overhead compartment, not for help, but to shut it, to protect the moment. Adrian did not yell. He did not demand apologies or scream for justice. He simply held his position, injured, bleeding, but composed in a way that unnerved even those uninvolved. His silence carried weight, purpose. This wasn't vengeance. It was strategy. And for the first time since the wheels left the tarmac, Rhett Malden looked uncertain. Adrian lowered the stirrer, turned, and walked back to his seat without another word. The gesture echoed louder than any threat. Evan watched him, eyes wide with quiet admiration. Then, without drawing attention, he moved to the galley and opened a small compartment behind the service panel. He placed the stirrer inside, wrapped in a napkin, sealing away what might become the only evidence that would matter. A single thought pulsed through Adrian's mind as he leaned back into his seat, ignoring the throbbing in his skull and the blood drying on his collar. Sometimes silence carries a sharper edge than shouting. Rhett turned on his heel and made to retreat, But Adrian was already standing. Not with rage, not with panic, with control so precise it chilled the air around him. His posture was upright, his movements methodical, like a man stepping into a storm not to escape it, but to anchor its path. "Come with me," Adrian said, not raising his voice, not needing to. His hand brushed lightly against Rhett's elbow, but the gesture wasn't a threat. It was command disguised in grace. The power in it didn't come from force. It came from certainty. Rhett stiffened, uncertain whether to resist or comply, but something in Adrian's gaze, steel beneath frost, made the choice for him. They moved toward the galley, the narrow corridor suddenly feeling longer, darker. The hum of the engines faded into a muffled backdrop as tension flooded the pressurized air. Curtains whispered closed behind them. Adrian wasn't hiding. He was isolating. Isolating truth from performance. Evan Rourke followed, silent but wide-eyed. He didn't know why his legs moved. He didn't know whether to intervene or bear witness. All he knew was that something irreversible was about to occur. Inside the galley, surrounded by trays, compartments, and the soft buzz of overhead lights, Adrian turned. Rhett hovered near the wall, caught between the emergency phone and the exit door, his chest rising and falling with shallow, nervous breaths. "You wanted to make a scene," Adrian said softly, the words curling in the air with precision. "Let's give them a truth they'll remember." Rhett's shoulders twitched. His hand inched subtly toward the wall-mounted phone. His fingers trembled. Adrian noticed. In a single, fluid motion, he stepped forward and grabbed Rhett's wrist, not yanking it, but guiding it downward with slow, undeniable force. There was no hesitation, just certainty. Rhett flinched, but the grip didn't tighten. It just moved, like water with the weight of iron. "You drew first blood," Adrian whispered, his voice so low it barely stirred the air between them. "You end it." Rhett tried to speak. His lips parted in confusion, maybe to defend himself, maybe to lie. But before the words could form, Adrian reached into Rhett's vest pocket. He drew out the same metal coffee stirrer that had pierced his ear only moments ago. Its thin length caught the sterile galley light, gleaming like a sliver of intent made solid. Adrian turned Rhett's hand palm up, pressed the stirrer into it. His grip remained soft, deliberate. Then, slowly, methodically, he lifted Rhett's hand and pressed it toward his own face. An inch from Rhett's throat, the stirrer hovered. Rhett's breath caught. His knees wobbled slightly. For the first time, the man who had operated behind smirks and shadowed plans looked exposed, not in body, but in soul. His arrogance peeled away beneath Adrian's silence. "You wanted control," Adrian continued, the words barely more than breath. "Then, control it." He pressed Rhett's hand down again, not violently, not with fury, but with conviction, guiding the metal sliver until it touched Rhett's lower lip, scraped briefly against his teeth, then dropped with a soft metallic clink to the galley floor. The silence that followed was enormous. Rhett stood still, lips parted, mouth trembling. No blood had been drawn, no bruise formed, but the defeat in his eyes was total. Adrian stepped back, not needing to say more. He didn't gloat. He didn't threaten. He simply existed in the aftermath, a man who had chosen message over retaliation. Evan, standing at the edge of the galley, swallowed hard. He bent slowly, picked up the stirrer from the floor, and slid it into a hidden compartment near the supply drawers. No words passed between him and Adrian, but the look he gave, the blend of awe, loyalty, and fear, said everything. The engines hummed again, louder this time, as though time had resumed. The plane rocked gently, oblivious to what had passed behind the curtain. Rhett remained where he was, gulping air, his mask of dominance shattered. Adrian adjusted the cuff of his sleeve, turned without looking back, and walked past Evan with the quiet dignity of a man who had reclaimed more than pride. He had reclaimed the narrative. Power isn't noise. It's knowing when to make silence speak. Adrian barely had time to settle into his seat before Rhett disappeared into the rear galley like a man chasing shadows. The flight had stabilized, but the atmosphere remained taut, thick with invisible threads of tension. Across the quiet hum of the engines, there was no comfort, only anticipation. Behind the partition curtain, Rhett's composure unraveled. His hands trembled as he unpinned a concealed transmitter from the inner lining of his vest. Pressing it close to his lips, he whispered frantically, his voice tight and hushed. Initiation failed. He resisted, too composed. Static crackled on the line, followed by a curt, clipped voice. Proceed with fallback. No escalation unless provoked. Maintain optics. Rhett swallowed hard, his jaw twitching. His fingers hovered near the send toggle, then pulled back. The stir incident hadn't gone as planned. He had expected panic, a meltdown, maybe even a strike from the target. But Adrian Vance had responded with surgical clarity. Not violence, not chaos. Control. Meanwhile, in Seat 1A, Adrian leaned forward slightly, his right eye still watering from the trauma, but his hand steady as it rested on the armrest. With practiced discretion, he activated his encrypted tablet and tapped out a command sequence, barely audible keystrokes beneath his breath. A security protocol initialized. Incident breach. Astra 219. The moment his fingertip landed on the final digit, the signal burst silently through the satellite uplink. It was more than an alert. It was a tether. The signal pinged Neural Dynamics' internal server, marking the flight, the coordinates, and the timestamp. Almost immediately, his smartwatch responded with a faint buzz and a flashing green light. Audio capture had begun. Ambient cabin noise, seat creaks, distant engine hum, the nervous clicks of utensils. It all flowed into the device. Adrian didn't need the camera feeds. He had a witness now. Silence itself. Across the aisle, a man in a dark executive suit shifted slightly. Lucan Maris. Clean-cut, mid-40s, no tie. His watch was a rare foreign model, and his fingers tapped rhythmically against his armrest, not out of boredom, but observation. He watched Adrian with feigned indifference, but there was something too focused in his stare, something rehearsed. Adrian noticed him, and their eyes briefly met. Lucan gave the faintest nod, acknowledging the moment like a man who had seen enough but was paid to remain neutral. What Adrian didn't yet know was that Lucan wasn't just a fellow passenger. He was a corporate intelligence operative, embedded as an observer under the guise of executive travel. He wasn't watching the flight. He was watching Adrian, and the performance had only just begun. In the galley, Rhett's grip tightened around the edge of the beverage cart. His heart pounded harder than the engine vibration beneath his feet. He replayed the scene in his mind. The failed jab. The confrontation. The way Adrian had twisted the moment against him. It should have ended in a spectacle. But now, Rhett was the one humiliated. And the voice on the other end? It had gone quiet. Cold. When he finally stepped back into the aisle, his face was a mask of artificial calm. But his limbs betrayed him, jerky, unsure. Adrian didn't flinch. He didn't speak. He simply watched. "Is there anything else I can assist you with, sir?" Rhett asked, lips tight around the word "sir," like it left a bitter taste. Adrian looked up with unsettling stillness. His voice, when it came, was quiet, void of heat. "You've done enough." A pause. Then Adrian leaned forward slightly as if sharing a secret between enemies. "Next time you stage a breakdown," he murmured, "try to turn off fewer lights." Rhett's eyes narrowed. He almost retorted, but something behind Adrian's gaze held him back. He turned away abruptly and disappeared once again behind the curtain, vanishing into the galley like a stagehand awaiting cues. Back in his seat, Adrian clenched his jaw as another pulse of pain surged through his ear. Blood had crusted near the collar of his shirt. The stain was minor, but its symbolism wasn't. He opened his tablet again, scanning the incoming logs. The smartwatch had already captured the whisper transmissions, Rhett's calls, the external voice. Everything was time-stamped, mirrored, and locked on a secure off-site cloud via Norell's crisis framework. Across the aisle, Lucan Maris didn't move, but he shifted his weight, now clearly more alert. His thumb hovered over a button on his own wrist device. He was no longer observing a man. He was witnessing a shift in strategy. And still, no one in the cabin spoke a word. Time passed. Minutes ticked like drumbeats in the background of a silent war. Then came the moment. Rhett re-emerged again, this time with a red medical kit in his hands. His posture was more controlled, his voice smoother. "I'd like to inspect your injury, sir." "The captain insists we document it for the log." Adrian tilted his head slightly, not as permission, but as warning. Rhett moved closer, kneeling slightly beside the seat, eyes darting between Adrian's temple and throat. His hand reached, not for the injury, but drifting dangerously near the base of Adrian's neck. And that's when Adrian moved. It was fluid, precise, a motion born from restraint and calculation, not rage. He caught Rhett's wrist mid-reach, twisted it downward, and forced his fingers open. The glint of metal caught the light, the same stirrer, tucked subtly into Rhett's palm. With a single movement, Adrian turned the man's own hand against him and drove the thin rod downward, not violently but deliberately, until it slid between Rhett's clenched teeth. Rhett gagged, recoiling, spitting the stirrer onto the floor. No screams, no audience. Only the low whine of air currents outside the fuselage, the stillness of an altitude far removed from law and gravity. Rhett fell back, clutching his jaw, staring up at Adrian with a look that finally resembled fear. Adrian leaned in, his voice a whisper now only Rhett could hear. "You brought the weapon." "I simply let it speak." He stood, straightened his suit jacket, and turned back to his seat with mechanical calm. Behind him, Rhett stumbled away. And somewhere across the cabin, Lucan Maris finally tapped his watch, unseen, but no longer uninterested. When the stage is rigged, the truth becomes the only weapon left to improvise. The stirrer hit Rhett's teeth with a click like a snapped bone. Adrian had moved before instinct could second-guess him. One moment, Rhett was leaning in with a shaking hand under the guise of a medical check. The next, his own wrist was trapped in Adrian's iron grip, twisted and forced downward. The metal rod, a coffee stirrer still slick with dried blood, drove against his clenched jaw until his teeth parted in reflex. Adrian didn't yell. He didn't even breathe heavily. His motions were precise, silent, deliberate. The kind of silence forged not from fear, but from absolute control. Rhett gagged, eyes bulging as the metal pressed against the back of his tongue, pain and humiliation crashing into him all at once. And then Adrian let go. Rhett collapsed backward onto the seat edge, coughing, sputtering, one hand clawing at his mouth while the other grasped blindly at the air between them. Adrian didn't flinch. He simply adjusted his cuffs and sat back in his chair as though nothing had happened. No one screamed. No flight attendant came running. The only sound in the cabin was the constant hum of the engines, louder now, as if nature itself was holding back judgment. From the curtain near the galley, Evan Rourke froze mid-step. His eyes darted between the two men, caught in a moment that redefined loyalty. He had seen enough by now to understand what was at stake, but understanding and action were not always aligned. For the second time that flight, Evan felt his conscience stir like a waking animal. Adrian kept his eyes forward, body perfectly still. Yet inside, his mind raced. The attack hadn't just been an act of cruelty. It was the final step in a sequence carefully choreographed from takeoff, each encounter designed to provoke him, to capture a single moment of retaliation that could be twisted into something damning. He thought back to the whisper he'd overheard minutes ago, when Rhett, behind the curtain, spoke in hushed tones into the transmitter clipped beneath his vest. The voice on the other end had been curt and mechanical. Abort physical contact. Maintain narrative control. That meant one thing: they hadn't expected Adrian to resist this calmly. He was playing a role they couldn't script. A man under fire, yet not falling apart. He scanned the cabin again. The witnesses to the earlier assault were gone, moved rows away under the captain's vague excuse of a balance adjustment. It wasn't standard protocol. It was stage management. Control the camera, control the audience, and let perception sculpt the truth. But Adrian had been one step ahead. The stirrer, now coated in saliva and blood, lay on the floor between Rhett's shoes. He didn't dare touch it. Adrian's watch blinked once, a silent indicator that the audio buffer had synced. Every whisper, every scrape of the transmitter. Captured, stored, transmitted in real time to Neural Dynamics' internal vault. He tapped his knee twice, triggering a backup sync. Even if they confiscated the device after landing, the data was already mirrored. Rhett finally stood, wiping his mouth with the back of his trembling hand. He tried to muster a glare but failed. Instead, he backed away toward the galley, vanishing behind the curtain like a failed magician retreating from a botched trick. Adrian didn't follow. He didn't need to. The tide had turned, and Rhett knew it. Moments later, the intercom came to life with a burst of static. "This is your captain. We've just been informed of a minor medical situation on board. Please remain in your seats as we assess the situation." Adrian's brows lowered. Medical situation. It was a redirect, an excuse, a distraction to reset the narrative, to paint him unstable, injured, erratic, foreshadowing for the landing crew waiting below. He reached under the seat and pulled out his carry-on. From a hidden flap inside, he removed a slim tablet and synced it with his watch. A prompt blinked. "Would you like to prepare incident report? Type 7, sabotage, reputation harm." He tapped yes. The interface faded into a live dashboard, recordings lined in rows, timestamps cross-referenced with cabin events. The audio logs alone would be enough to trigger an internal investigation. But it wasn't justice he was after. It was the truth, clean and irrefutable. Just as he minimized the window, Evan emerged from the curtain. He knelt discreetly, pretending to adjust a floor vent. "I saw everything," he whispered, voice tight with fear but clearer than before. "The camera's off." "But your watch caught it, right?" Adrian nodded, barely. "They're planning something when we land," Evan added. "I overheard the captain talking to someone outside protocol." He said, "The package is secured. Perception will do the rest." "That's not normal. That's not how we handle passengers." Adrian studied him, weighing his words not for truth, but for risk. "You'll be asked questions," he said softly. "Tell the truth. No embellishment. Just facts." I will," Evan stammered. "I promise." "I kept the stirrer, the one from earlier. I hid it under the service panel behind 3B. No one knows." Adrian's eyes narrowed, impressed. "Then you've already done more than most." Evan nodded and retreated, the gravity of what he'd committed to finally settling on his face. Adrian leaned back into the seat, closing his eyes, not to rest, but to map out the next moves. His mind worked like a quiet engine, calculating who had the motive, who had the reach, and who had the arrogance to assume he would break without thinking. Rhett had returned fire with the tools of subtle violence, but Adrian had returned silence with something sharper, and though the passengers around him remained unaware of the war unfolding between row numbers and service trays, they would soon learn that the man in the charcoal suit wasn't just a CEO. They would see him as what the conspirators feared most: unbroken. And as Rhett sat curled in the galley, staring blankly ahead, he knew that whatever script they'd written for this performance had failed at its climax. The truth had refused to play its part. Retribution doesn't always roar. It breathes through control. Rhett stumbled into the rear galley, one hand clutching his mouth, the other gripping the edge of a service cart as if it could anchor him in place. His breath came in uneven bursts, the sting of humiliation sharper than the ache in his jaw. The metal stirrer had scraped his teeth, not broken them, but the damage to his pride was far worse. His eyes were wide, unfocused, as though trying to process a reality that had slipped from his grip. For a moment he leaned against the wall, silently mouthing words, perhaps to calm himself, or perhaps to deny what had just occurred. He turned, glancing toward the curtain that separated first class from the rest of the aircraft. No one followed. No one came to his defense. The power he once wielded as the flight's authority figure now flickered like a dying light. When he activated the concealed transmitter in his vest, his voice was hoarse, brittle. He snapped. It was worse than expected. There was no response. Rhett tapped the device again, more urgently this time. "Do you copy?" Directive said he'd lash out. We got it. He forced it down, right into my... He froze. The channel remained dead, not even static. At that same moment, Adrian Vance sat in the front row, chest rising slowly with each breath, his ear still damp with blood. His expression was calm, but it was a calm sharpened by precision, not peace. Every breath he took was measured, every movement deliberate. He wiped his fingers clean and opened his data pad on his lap, the glass surface lighting up with a dull blue glow. With a tap, a secure interface blinked to life, an overlay only visible through his credentials. At the top of the screen, Live Capture, Stream. Secure to Norel Dynamics. Status, active. The smartwatch on his wrist continued to record ambient audio. Rhett's panicked whispers from the galley, captured. Evan's confession, captured. The stirrer clattering to the floor, captured. Adrian's only regret was that he hadn't turned on video, but even without it, the sound was damning enough. Evan Rourke lingered nearby, pacing slowly, trying to look busy with tray inventory. His hands trembled slightly, but his jaw was set. When he finally approached Adrian, he did so with careful steps, crouching beside the row with his back to the aisle. "They told him you'd react," he whispered, his voice nearly lost in the low cabin hum. "They wanted this recorded, to use it later." Adrian turned his head slightly, studying Evan's face. The younger man looked afraid, but not for himself. "They?" Adrian asked softly. "I don't know exactly." But Rhett kept saying it had to be dramatic. "That you needed to look dangerous," Evan replied, eyes darting behind him as if the curtain might suddenly open. He was coached. Before the flight, Adrian absorbed the words in silence. A trap, not of pain, but of perception. He wasn't meant to die. He was meant to react, to lose control, to become the villain. He leaned back against the headrest, letting the weight of the realization settle. His mind, trained in high-stakes boardrooms and delicate negotiations, pieced together the logic. It wasn't about hurting him physically. It was about capturing a moment, just one, where he looked volatile. One flash of emotion, one act of retaliation, one manipulated recording, enough to crush a career. But they had underestimated one thing. Adrian Vance did not move without calculation. The hum of the cabin deepened as the aircraft began its descent. A light pinged overhead. Fasten seatbelts. Adrian's gaze sharpened. The intercom crackled. The captain's voice, tight with tension, broke the silence. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've been advised to prepare for an unscheduled landing. Law enforcement will meet the aircraft upon arrival. Please remain in your seats," gasps whispered through the aisles. Nervous glances were exchanged. Somewhere in economy, a child began to cry. Adrian glanced down at the screen again. His data stream remained intact. The upload had reached 87%, nearly complete. Across the aisle, Luke and Maris sat motionless, arms folded, expression unreadable. He had barely blinked since the incident. Adrian studied him for a beat longer, then turned back to Evan. "Evan," he said quietly, "did Rhett use the service phone after the attack?" Evan nodded once. Briefly. But not through the airline system. It was private, some kind of patch. Adrian closed his eyes. That meant coordination. Someone had planted Rhett. Someone had ensured the cabin cameras were disabled. Someone had timed the turbulence, the coffee, the stirrer, all of it. He opened his eyes and asked, "Where is the stirrer?" "I tucked it behind the emergency cutlery compartment," Evan said. "Didn't want anyone to throw it away." "It's got blood on it." "Yours and his good," Adrian murmured. Then came a shift in the air, a ripple of unease. One of the flight attendants returned from the cockpit, stepping swiftly into the galley. Rhett was still seated on a folding stool, head in hands, muttering to himself. "They're sending agents," the attendant said. "2, maybe 3. Rhett looked up slowly. His face twitched. "They'll believe me. He's the one who forced it." The attendant said nothing, just turned and left. Adrian rose from his seat. He moved slowly, deliberately, back straight, expression composed. His body ached, his ear still throbbed, but none of it showed on his face. He stopped near the galley and stared down the aisle toward the door that would soon open. Evan stepped beside him. "What now?" Adrian didn't answer right away. He stared through the cabin window at the clouds breaking beneath the plane, a sliver of runway visible beyond. Then, softly, he said, "They're not waiting to ask questions. They're waiting to claim a story." He lunged forward, jabbing a metal stirrer at the CEO's ear, sneering as chaos filled the aisle. "If you believe no uniform justifies abuse, hit subscribe now, because justice rises higher than hate." The landing gear jolted into position with a mechanical thud beneath the cabin floor. Tension surged through the fuselage like static before a lightning strike. Dr. Adrian Vance didn't flinch. His hands remained folded, blood dried in sharp lines along his neck, collar soaked, posture impeccable. Directly across the aisle, Rhett Malden sat alone near the rear bulkhead, trembling with barely restrained anxiety. His lips moved constantly, not in conversation but in frantic whispers, like a man bargaining with ghosts. The cabin had fallen into a hush that felt too deliberate. The attendants moved robotically, offering nothing but surface-level professionalism. Evan Rourke lingered in the galley, eyes occasionally darting toward Adrian with a mix of dread and unspoken loyalty. He knew what was coming, and so did Adrian. The soft ping of the seatbelt sign echoed overhead. Then the front cabin door clicked open. 2 federal agents stepped inside, suits crisp, eyes unreadable. A third figure in a black security uniform stood behind them, holding an earpiece. Their body language held no curiosity, no uncertainty, only execution. They had come not to question, but to extract. From the shadows of his row, Rhett stood abruptly. His voice cracked with a false courage. "He attacked me. He tried to kill me," he shouted, one trembling finger stabbing the air toward Adrian. "I tried to help him, and he lost control." The cabin stirred. Passengers who had remained frozen now glanced nervously from side to side, unsure who to believe. A few shrank back in their seats. Adrian rose slowly, like a monument, not a man. His movements were quiet but commanding. He said nothing in response. Blood marked his left temple like a badge he refused to wipe away. His calm eyes met the lead agent's gaze. Agent Cassian Dorn, a man in his late 40s with frost-gray temples and a face built from suspicion, scanned both men in silence before giving a short nod. "Escort both separately," he ordered, voice level. 2 officers flanked Rhett, who now looked more disoriented than outraged. Adrian didn't resist as another pair stepped to his side, flanking him with quiet, rehearsed efficiency. As Adrian stepped into the aisle, his gaze flickered toward Evan. It was the smallest gesture, a nod, imperceptible to most, intentional to one. Evan's breath caught in his throat. He turned, walking back toward the rear galley where he had hidden the metal stirrer in a linen drawer tucked beneath sealed water bottles. With one quick movement, he retrieved it and slipped it into his jacket's interior pocket, right over his heart. A low murmur moved through the cabin like a wave behind them. Adrian said nothing as they led him past the cockpit, past wide-eyed passengers, past Rhett's pale and sweating figure. His mind was not on the descent or the impending confrontation, but on every step that had led here. From the first glare to the stirrer, to the missing cabin footage. Each piece now hovered in position, waiting for the moment to fall into place. They reached the jet bridge. Outside, a wall of uniforms and glass-eyed cameras waited. The media had already arrived, fed in advance. The narrative was moving ahead of him now. Somewhere, a headline had already been written. But Adrian Vance didn't bend to momentum. He crafted his own. He walked steadily, deliberately, one pace after the other. Eyes forward, shoulders back. Evan remained behind, his hand brushing the pocket where the stirrer now sat like a fragment of hidden truth. He whispered under his breath, so quiet it barely left his lips. Let them come. Justice rarely waits. It hides in plain sight, waiting to be revealed. The interrogation room smelled like sterilized metal and tired lies. Adrian Vance sat perfectly upright in the metal chair, the harsh fluorescent lights bleaching the room into a shade of clinical suspicion. Across from him, two airport officers, one in a Navy uniform with epaulettes, the other in plain clothes, slid a black tablet across the table. The screen flickered for a moment before stabilizing into grainy footage. "Watch closely," said Officer Pell, voice clipped. "We want your response on record." The footage played. The cabin of Flight Astra 219. A trembling camera angle. Adrian standing, his hand forcing a metal stirrer toward Rhett Malden's open mouth. No blood on Rhett. No context. No sign of the initial assault. Just Adrian. Calm, composed, violent. Adrian didn't flinch. "That's not the beginning," he said evenly. "It's the beginning we have," Pell replied, arms folded as though that were an answer. The other officer, a younger man named Hart, leaned forward. "Sir, this is a serious matter. The footage shows you threatening a flight attendant with a metal object. You've got blood on your collar and bruising around your jawline. The narrative isn't in your favor." Adrian's voice never rose. "Then let me offer a different narrative. I'd like to contact Norrell Dynamics' Internal Security Division." Hart frowned. "For what purpose?" Adrian looked him dead in the eye. "To show you the beginning, you don't have." They exchanged a glance. Pell muttered something under his breath but nodded. "One call. Make it count." Adrian opened his encrypted tablet, fingers steady despite the ringing still echoing in his skull from the earlier trauma. Within seconds, he initiated a request with a 3-factor authorization tied to Norrell's emergency breach protocols. A few more taps. A green confirmation light pulsed. 30 seconds passed. Then a soft chime. A file appeared. Incident breach 219.audio. Time-stamped, locked, mirrored, uneditable. He turned the screen toward them. "Play it," he said. They did. The audio was crisp, crystal clear. It captured Rhett's voice in detail, sarcastic tones, the clatter of the stirrer, Adrian's pained gasp, Evan's hushed warning. Then Rhett's voice again, low, cold, muttering into a transmitter. First strike complete. His reactions coming. Pell's jaw slackened. Hart stared, stunned. This isn't part of our cabin recordings." Adrian leaned in slightly, voice calm but slicing through the tension like a scalpel. "That's because the cabin cameras were disabled before takeoff." "By him. Check the timestamps on your logs. They'll confirm the system was powered down before we left the tarmac." Pell swore under his breath. He tapped rapidly on his own device, cross-referencing security logs with Adrian's audio. The blood drained from his face. In the adjoining room, Rhett Malden was unraveling. Pacing with sweaty hands clenched into fists, he glared at the mirror, unaware that behind it, Agent Cassian Dorn had entered quietly and now stood watching. "I want a lawyer," Rhett snapped at the officer assigned to monitor him. "I want my union rep." "I want." The officer didn't respond. Instead, a door opened. Dorn stepped in. "You'll get all that," Dorn said. His tone was calm, but the kind of calm that came before a storm. "But first, let's talk about your brother." Rhett froze. "What?" "Lathancorp. That's the name on the buried proposal Norel Dynamics rejected 3 months ago. Your brother Nolan was the registered agent under an alias. That proposal was routed through a shell firm tied to a contracting company who just happened to be subcontracted to your flight route's security protocols." Rhett's breathing quickened. I don't know what you're talking about." Dorn smiled faintly. "Then you shouldn't have used the same transmitter frequency that was already flagged last year in a corporate sabotage case." In the main room, Adrian sat silent as the officers scrambled. Pell was now frantically calling for their tech specialist. Hart reviewed the chain of custody report on the surveillance footage and found, just as Adrian predicted, a 5-minute gap at the beginning of the file. A gap that conveniently removed the moment of attack. "What was meant to happen," Adrian said softly, more to himself than anyone else, "was simple. He provokes me. I react. They capture that moment. They sell the story. Ruin me." Pell turned to him, visibly shaken. "You're saying this was a coordinated character hit?" "No," Adrian replied. "It was a reputational assassination. You can recover from a scandal, not from a rerun on every news channel showing you forcing metal down a man's throat." Dorn entered the room just then, a file in hand, expression unreadable. "It gets worse," he said, setting it down. "We've identified Rhett's contact frequency. The voice on the other end went silent the moment he entered custody. But metadata shows recurring contacts with encrypted lines linked to 3 different competitor firms. One of them shares board members with Lathancorp." Adrian tilted his head slightly, watching the implications unfold. "You were never meant to reach Halvane," Dorn continued. "If this had gone to plan, you would have been arrested on landing, your board forced into crisis mode, and your merger abandoned under shareholder panic." Hart sat back, eyes wide. "All over a metal stirrer?" Adrian turned to him, voice low and cutting. "Not a stirrer. A symbol. They wanted a headline. CEO assaults crew with prototype weapon. Norel Dynamics builds smart defensive implants. Tie me to a violent object? Investors flee." Pal rubbed his face with both hands. "This is bigger than we thought." "Far bigger," Dorn said. "We've just stumbled into a web of industrial espionage, maybe larger than one company." Adrian stood slowly. Blood still stained his collar, but his back was straight, his voice unwavering. "Then untangle it. And make sure the real footage sees daylight." Dorn nodded, already dialing. A moment later, the interrogation room door opened, revealing a hallway now crowded with reporters, security, and waiting chaos. Flashbulbs flared. Questions were shouted. Adrian paused at the threshold. The officers expected him to be angry, defensive, panicked, but he wasn't. He stood in the spotlight calmly, with the steadiness of a man who had outmaneuvered a storm midair. And for the first time since Flight Astra 219 began, a faint smile touched his lips. The fall never ends where gravity begins. It ends where the truth lands. Flashing cameras lit the tarmac like lightning as Adrian Vance stepped off Flight Astra 219, his charcoal suit stained with a dark blotch at the collar where blood had dried. A phalanx of security officers parted the crowd while news banners rolled across terminal screens. CEO assaults flight crew. Corporate violence in the sky. The footage playing on repeat was damning. A freeze frame of Adrian holding the metal stirrer near Rhett Malden's face, his expression unreadable, yet framed to look merciless. The noise was deafening. Reporters shouted questions. Bystanders recorded with phones raised. Yet amid the chaos, Adrian walked calmly, his gaze fixed ahead, refusing to feed the storm. A million judgments were forming before a single fact had been weighed. Inside the airport's private security wing, the conference room was already converted into a makeshift media command post. Screens showed the same clip from every angle, except the truth. Agent Cassian Dorn entered the room moments later, his suit damp with rain, his jaw tight. "You've got a storm above your head," he muttered as he shut the door behind him. Adrian remained seated, eyes fixed on his tablet. "Let them scream," he replied softly. "Truth doesn't raise its voice. It waits outside. The public devoured the narrative. Blogs, networks, and media watchdogs dissected every pixel of the circulating footage. Talk shows called Adrian dangerous, arrogant, proof that power corrupts. It was all moving exactly as someone had designed, but they hadn't accounted for what came next. At precisely 10:47 a.m., Norel Dynamics' legal division released a secure press bulletin. Inside was a full digital package, audio logs, time-stamped metadata, and a mirror feed recording synced from Adrian's smartwatch. It included the missing minutes before the altercation, the moment Rhett shoved the metal stirrer into Adrian's ear, the whispered exchanges, and proof the cabin cameras had been disabled manually before takeoff. The effect was immediate. Like a tide changing direction, social media flipped. Hashtags shifted from hashtag CEO violence to hashtag staged assault. Commentators who had once condemned now questioned. "Why were the cameras turned off?" one anchor asked on air. "Who benefits from sabotaging a CEO mid-flight?" As the public tried to reorient inside a separate room in the airport's Federal Operations Wing, Agent Dorn reviewed the files alone. The audio feed revealed more than just the altercation. It hinted at a larger orchestration. He picked up a dusty folder from a locked drawer, one marked with a red diagonal slash across the cover. Project Halcyon. A defunct operation, supposedly. The briefing inside described a covert program once aimed at destabilizing corporate leadership through engineered airborne crises. Targeted reputation collapses. Mergers derailed. Market influence controlled by fear. "This wasn't random," Dorn said aloud, tapping the edge of the folder. "This was a playbook move." He called Adrian in. "You ever hear of Halcyon?" Dorn asked. Adrian raised an eyebrow, slowly sitting forward. "I've heard of storms." "Not ghosts," Dorn tossed the file on the table. "It was shelved years ago, but some of the contractors listed here match subcontractors Norel refused contracts to, including one owned by a Nolan Malden." Adrian's expression darkened. The name struck like flint to stone. Rhett's brother, gone silent, untraceable since the flight landed. "And if I had overreacted?" Adrian asked, voice cold. "If I had hurt him worse?" "They'd have leaked it before you hit the ground," Dorn answered. "And your merger?" "Dead. Your board? Scattered. Norel would have bled shares into the hands of your competitors." Adrian nodded once. "Then this wasn't an attack." Dorn met his eyes. It was a harvest. The implications twisted deeper than betrayal. Rhett hadn't acted out of personal malice alone. He had been a pawn, a lit fuse carried aboard to ignite a chain reaction. A spark meant to collapse a company by branding its leader as violent and unstable. Back in the press room, analysts scrambled to revise their takes. One of the journalists, Lucas Perrin, stood before a live camera and said, "We may have witnessed not a CEO's fall from grace, but an attempted assassination of character, with a plane as the weapon." Still, Adrian refused to take the mic. He left the terminal surrounded by lawyers, his silence calculated. Every absence of a soundbite only raised the stakes of his presence. He understood the gravity of restraint. Power didn't rush to speak. It waited for truth to walk in and speak for itself. Yet somewhere, far from the cameras, in a dim corporate basement, someone else watched the news with grim satisfaction. An encrypted terminal blinked red. Nolan Malden was already gone. But behind his flight was a trail of data. files marked with sigils from other companies, masked shell firms, and one name buried deeper than the rest: Draven Lore. Adrian stared at his reflection in the black glass of the town car window, watching the city blur past. His thoughts moved with methodical clarity. The enemy had tried to destroy his name, not with a weapon, but with perception. But he had something they didn't count on: proof. And now he had a partner inside the investigation. As the city skyline sharpened into view, Adrian leaned forward and whispered almost to himself, "Some battles don't start on the ground. They descend with the landing gear." The report landed on Adrian's desk with a quiet thud. He didn't move, not at first. He sat frozen in his high-backed leather chair, the skyline of Halvane City sprawling behind him like a painting he hadn't looked at in days. The wound on his ear had healed partially, but the bandage remained, a subtle warning to anyone who walked into that room that power, if misread, could bleed. But it wasn't pain that anchored Adrian in that moment. It was the first line of the document he'd just opened. Forensic analysis: trace residues, molybdenum disulfide, and gear-laced polymer oil detected on subject object. His fingers hovered above the page, eyes narrowing as he read deeper. These substances had no business on a cabin utensil. Not unless the stir had been manufactured somewhere it shouldn't have. Not unless it had been placed in that galley drawer on purpose. Not unless he'd been framed. A slow exhale left Adrian's chest. He turned the page. Across the room, Agent Cassian Dorn stood silently by the glass wall, arms folded, watching Adrian read. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The silence broke when Adrian said, "This was never just about provocation." His voice was calm, but beneath it ran the tight wire of realization. "No," Dorn replied, stepping closer. "This was engineering. Precise, intentional. They used you like a stage Adrian turned in his chair. They wanted me to react." Dorn nodded. "And they wanted the world to watch." A long pause stretched between them. Adrian's eyes drifted back to the report. He flipped to the final page, Evan Rourke's handwritten statement. The junior flight attendant had retrieved the original stirrer after the incident, hiding it behind a false panel in the galley's waste compartment. His decision, made without instruction or strategy, had turned out to be pivotal. The analysis confirmed what Adrian now saw clearly. The object was never part of the plane's service set. It bore micro-etchings on its shaft, serial codes traced not to the airline's supplier, but to a factory owned by Lythencorp's heavy-grade tool division. Adrian's jaw set tightly. "They didn't just attack me," he said, low and certain. "They tried to turn me into a symbol of instability." Dorn walked to the window, glancing at the skyline. "If it worked, the merger would have collapsed under board pressure. You'd be forced to resign, and your company, everything you've worked for, would have gone to scavengers. And Norel Dynamics' biotechnical patents would have been absorbed into Lythencorp's acquisition funnels," Adrian added, standing now, his palm resting flat on the folder. The pieces fit with horrifying clarity, but something still didn't sit right. He turned toward Dorn. "Why a stirrer? Why that object?" The agent hesitated, then pulled another document from his coat. "Because it's traceable." They knew if things escalated, if you retaliated, they could plant a narrative that you were developing aggressive prototypes, weaponized materials disguised as consumer tools. The headlines would read, "CEO assaults crew with one of his own devices," all fabricated. Adrian's hand clenched into a fist, then relaxed. "They didn't want my blood," he whispered. "They wanted my name." "State your name for the record," the judge's voice rang through the chamber, sharp and impassive. "Rhett Malden," he whispered almost inaudibly. "Louder." "Rhett Malden," he repeated, this time his voice brittle as if it might splinter under pressure. The room was silent but heavy, as though the walls themselves held their breath. The federal hearing had begun hours ago, but now, at last, Rhett had been called to the witness stand. Adrian Vance sat several rows back, unmoving, dressed in a slate-gray suit. His face revealed nothing, but his eyes didn't blink. Not once. The courtroom lights reflected off the soft bandage still tucked behind his right ear, a subtle reminder of the violence hidden behind formality. The prosecutor leaned forward. "Mr. Malden, were you acting alone when you assaulted Dr. Adrian Vance aboard Flight Astra 219? Rhett's jaw clenched. His fingers twisted together on the wooden ledge. He swallowed, his Adam's apple jerking. "No." The single word snapped across the room like a wire pulled taut. "And who, specifically, gave you the order?" Rhett hesitated. Sweat glistened at his temple. He glanced to the side, searching the shadows of the room as if hoping to find protection, someone to stop this. But there was no one. Only the silent rows of spectators, legal staff, and Adrian, whose stillness seemed more unnerving than rage. "My brother," Rhett finally said, voice cracking. "Nolan Malden and another man. Name him." Rhett stared ahead, lips trembling, then gave in. "Draven Lore." A quiet stir passed through the courtroom, like a wind whispering through dry leaves. Adrian didn't move, but his heart gave one steady, defiant thump. The prosecutor's tone sharpened. "Draven Lore, head of Sylvain Corporation. A direct rival to Norel Dynamics?" "Yes." "And what exactly were you instructed to do?" Rhett's voice grew fainter, like a man confessing a sin to no one in particular. "Agitate him. Push him past the line. Make it look like Adrian Vance was unstable. Dangerous. Like he couldn't be trusted to lead. I was supposed to provoke a reaction. We had someone monitoring the feed. They would edit it, leak it to the press, collapse his image, kill the merger, tank the shares." The judge's gavel struck once, demanding silence as gasps rippled through the audience. The prosecutor leaned in, not with triumph, but urgency. "Did you believe you were doing the right thing?" Rhett looked down, his voice barely audible. "I believed I didn't have a choice." The weight of the confession settled like dust after an explosion, quiet, choking, irreversible. Adrian exhaled slowly, his grip loosening on the edge of his seat. He wasn't relieved. Not yet. The truth had emerged, yes, but it had done so only because the pressure had reached a breaking point. And pressure had a habit of rebuilding. The hearing continued for hours, unspooling names, encrypted communications, and financial trails that tied the Malden brothers to Lathan Corp shell companies and to a shadow board within Sylvain. Evidence of payments, contracts with no names but clear intent. And then, the stirrer. Evan Rourke's forensic report confirmed it had not originated from airline stock. It carried microscopic traces of industrial-grade lubricant used in manufacturing environments, not kitchens. It was a message in metal, planted to look like a violent prototype from Norel's own labs. It wasn't just a weapon. It was the narrative itself. Agent Cassian Dorn took the stand later that afternoon, calmly explaining how Adrian's smartwatch had transmitted audio that filled the gaps. Rhett's whispered conversations, his signal disruptions, the manipulation of passenger seating, each detail layered with precision that no amount of corporate spin could wash clean. By the end of the day, the verdict was clear. Rhett Malden was sentenced to 7 years for conspiracy, aggravated assault, and tampering with federal aviation surveillance systems. Warrants were issued for Nolan Malden and Draven Lore, but both men were gone. Vanished. Their last known locations were traced to a private terminal outside Corvin City, just hours before the warrant hit the system. Draven had left behind only a cryptic, half-corrupted digital file containing an ominous line. If control fails, discredit. If discredit fails, disappear. Adrian sat silently through the verdict, hands folded in his lap. He made no gesture of victory, no smile of vindication. He merely absorbed the moment. Justice had spoken, yes. But as he listened to the sentences read aloud, he felt no closure, only a hollow space where certainty used to be. Outside the courthouse, crowds had gathered, press, supporters, and skeptics alike. The barricades held them back, but their voices swelled like waves, demanding answers, cheering, questioning. A few signs bore his name in praise. Others asked, "Can we trust power?" Adrian stepped into the sunlight, Dorn beside him. For a long moment he looked out, not at the cameras, not at the chants, but at the faces, the uncertain, the angry, the hopeful. Some smiled, others frowned. Many simply waited. And in that moment, Adrian realized the truth didn't restore what had been broken. It only removed the mask. He turned slightly, speaking only to Dorn but loud enough for the microphones to catch. Truth doesn't erase damage, it just makes it visible. The envelope had no return address. It arrived in the late hours, slipped beneath the heavy oak door of Adrian Vance's office with the subtlety of a whisper. No knock, no footsteps. Just the faint rasp of paper against polished marble as it slid to a stop. Adrian glanced up from his desk, the low hum of the city outside his window barely reaching through the thick glass. His office lights cast sharp reflections across the room, cool white against smooth metal and glass, but it was the envelope that broke the order of his world. He stood slowly, the movement deliberate. His ear still bore the faint ache from Flight Astra 219, though the wound had healed. The incident was behind him, officially. Yet the air felt wrong, charged, like the pause before lightning touches earth. Adrian crouched, picked up the envelope, and ran a thumb along the edge. Standard ivory stock, clean seal, no stamp, no handwriting. He peeled it open. Inside was a single photograph, glossy and cold. It showed a section of the first-class cabin aboard Flight Astra 219. Adrian recognized the curve of the window, the blue-gray seat upholstery, the faint reflection of his own face turned slightly toward the aisle. But something was wrong. There, in the glass beside him, was a second figure, a reflection where none should exist. It wasn't Rhett. It wasn't Evan. This figure wore no uniform. His features were indistinct, blurred in motion, but the shape of the suit was unfamiliar. The face was just wrong. It was out of place, like something stitched into the moment from another time, not on the manifest, not in the memories. Beneath the photograph, typed in exacting mechanical letters, was a single line. "You survived one test. The next won't be airborne." Adrian's breath did not quicken. His pulse held steady, but something in him braced, as if the room had shifted beneath his feet without moving at all. He crossed back to his desk and set the photograph down, his fingertips lingering on its surface. The cold beneath the paper wasn't physical. It was something deeper, the kind that reminded you of unfinished equations, of moves made before you entered the game. He turned off the overhead light and stood in the dark, letting only the city's night glow bleed through the wide windows. In the half-light, the reflection in the office glass echoed the one in the photograph. But this time, Adrian stood alone. The Haldane Accord had launched 3 weeks earlier. It had been a triumph, heralded by news outlets, praised by ethics boards, and dissected by policymakers. Evan Rourke had taken his seat as the Accord's first director, and for a time Adrian allowed himself to believe the incident was now a closed chapter. Justice had spoken. Names had been exposed. Truth had landed. But the photograph reopened everything. He tapped a command on his console. The secure server screen lit up. Adrian began scanning logs, passenger manifests, flight crew rotations, window seat camera feeds from the unaltered backups Norell's legal division had stored in shadow systems. He checked for discrepancies in time-stamped data, in the shadows cast by the cabin lighting, in every line of the image's metadata. Nothing had been faked. The image was real. Its implications were not. 10 minutes passed. Then 20. No anomalies in official logs. But the reflection remained. Adrian leaned back, his eyes narrowing as the implications rippled through his mind. Someone had been on that plane, unaccounted for. Or someone had placed this image to suggest as much. Either way, this wasn't over. It was a continuation. A message. A test. His datapad buzzed. An encrypted note flashed across the screen. Echo node. Unauthorized access attempt detected at R&D Archive 7B. Adrian didn't move. Archive 7B contained preliminary blueprints tied to Norell's classified Neuralink research, technologies that had never left the design floor, that hadn't even reached patent review. Only 5 individuals had clearance. 4 were accounted for. The 5th had vanished months ago. Draven Lore. Adrian stood and stared at the window, the city below reduced to streaks of light and motion. His reflection stared back, fractured by glass. No tricks now, no second face, just him. But the photograph remained on his desk, real and impossible. He walked over, picked it up again, and studied the reflection, this time with no emotion. He wasn't afraid. He was preparing. The knock that came at the door a moment later wasn't unexpected. "Sir," came a voice, male, uncertain, a junior analyst from Norell's internal security. "There's been another breach ping, this time in the Zurich vault mirror." Same signature. Adrian didn't turn around. He folded the photo neatly and slipped it into the top drawer of his desk. The envelope followed. Then he shut the drawer with a quiet click and said only one thing. Low, calm, final. The sky never forgets what truth once carried. He tried to break another man's peace and met a silence that spoke louder than fear. If you believe dignity always wins in the end, subscribe now, because justice lands where it's most deserved. The story you just watched is fictional. It explores racism, power, and the moment justice turns the tables on cruelty. Its purpose is to raise awareness, inspire empathy, and spark conversations about equality, respect, and accountability.